Moscow, October 1941. The Wehrmacht is close enough to the capital that staff officers can hear the artillery through closed windows. Foreign embassies have already been evacuated east to Kuibyshev. Government files are burning in courtyard drums, the ash drifting over Red Square. Stalin himself is deciding whether to stay in the city or flee it, and the divisions that might save Moscow are sitting nearly 4,000 miles away in Siberia, frozen in place, because for a decade, the one fear that has ruled the Kremlin above all others is a two-front war, Germany from the west and Japan from the east, closing like a vice. And then a message arrives. It comes by radio, relayed out of Tokyo, decoded in a windowless room, and it says something the Soviet High Command has been praying to hear and has not dared to believe. Japan is not coming. The Imperial Japanese Command has made its decision, and it is not a strike north into Siberia. It is a strike south, against the American, British, and Dutch colonial possessions of the Pacific. The northern border is safe. Stalin can move his far eastern armies, battle-fresh, winter-equipped, never touched by the German war, west, to the gates of his own capital. This is not a guess. It is not a hopeful reading of troop movements. It is a fact, lifted almost word for word from the innermost deliberations of the Japanese cabinet, and it did not come from a spy hiding in the shadows. It came from a man sitting, at that very hour, inside the German embassy in Tokyo, a man the German ambassador called a friend, a man who had helped draft the ambassador's own secret cables to Berlin, a man who wore the Nazi Party's own badge on his lapel. His name, on the German embassy's guest list and the Frankfurter Zeitung's masthead, was Richard Sorge. On the Red Army's books, in a cipher only a handful of men in Moscow were cleared to read, he was known by a single word: Ramsay. Within weeks, Siberian divisions numbering in the hundreds of thousands would begin in training west across the length of Russia, arriving in time to throw themselves into the counteroffensive that broke the German army back from Moscow's suburbs in December 1941. Historians still argue over exactly how much of that transfer Sorge's message triggered, and how much Stalin had already set moving on his own intelligence, but no one argues that the message existed, or that it told Moscow something it desperately needed to hear at the worst possible hour of the war. How does a German journalist end up trusted enough by Hitler's own ambassador to help write his cables, while spying the entire time for Stalin? To understand that, you have to go back 20 years, to a wounded soldier in a German field hospital who had already decided, long before Tokyo, long before the embassy, exactly which side he was on. Richard Sorge was born on the 4th of October, 1895, in Ajikabul, near Baku, in the oil country of the Russian Empire, modern-day Azerbaijan. His father, Wilhelm Sorge, was a German mining engineer working the Caucasus oil fields. His mother, Nina, was Russian. There was an odd thread of family history running through him. A distant relative on his father's side, Friedrich Adolf Sorge, had been a personal friend and correspondent of Karl Marx himself. When Richard was a small boy, the family moved back to Germany, and he grew up in Berlin, a Russian-born German boy who would spend the rest of his life comfortable in more than one skin. He was 19 when the First World War came, and he went to it eagerly, the way so many young Germans did in 1914, certain of a short, glorious war. He got neither short nor glorious. He served on the Western Front and then the Eastern Front, and the war took pieces of him, shrapnel wounds more than once, that left him with fingers he would carry crooked for the rest of his life and a permanent limp he never fully shed. He was decorated for it, an Iron Cross among his medals, and in the long months of hospital recovery, surrounded by the broken remains of his generation, something in him turned. He read Marx in a hospital bed the way a man reads a message meant only for him. The war that was supposed to prove the glory of the old European order had instead, in his eyes, proved only its bankruptcy. Millions of young men fed into artillery for the vanity of kings and generals. By the time he was discharged, he had a doctorate in political science from the University of Hamburg and a settled, permanent conviction. The system that had done this to his generation deserved to be torn down, and only one movement on earth seemed serious about tearing it down. In 1919, he joined the German Communist Party. He worked as a coal miner for a time, and a school teacher, and a journalist, always circling the movement, always useful to it, organizing, writing, agitating in the Ruhr during the political chaos of the Weimar years. Moscow noticed him. In 1924, he was invited east, into the service of the Communist International, the Comintern, and from there, within a few years, into something far more secretive and far more permanent, Soviet military intelligence, the 4th Department of the Red Army's General Staff, the organization that would later be known as the GRU. He was given the codename Ramsay. He would carry it, on and off, for the rest of his working life. What made him valuable was never simply his loyalty. Moscow had no shortage of loyal men. What made Richard Sorge valuable was that he was, without any invention at all, a genuinely gifted journalist, a genuinely charming and cultured European, and a genuinely convincing German, the kind of man an embassy would want to know, not merely tolerate. His conviction was not a costume he could take off at the end of a shift. It was real, and it was buried so deep beneath the surface of an ordinary professional life that almost no one who met him ever saw past the surface at all. His training ground was China. In 1930, Moscow sent him to Shanghai under journalistic cover, ostensibly reporting for German agricultural and trade publications, while in fact building an intelligence network across a country being pulled apart by warlords, Japanese expansion, and a rising Chinese communist insurgency. Shanghai in those years was its own kind of underworld, a city carved into foreign concessions where French police, British police, and Chinese authorities all claimed jurisdiction, and none of them fully controlled the streets, where a European face and a plausible passport could move through checkpoints that would have stopped a Chinese revolutionary in seconds. It was the perfect classroom. Sorge learned there how to run couriers, how to vet a stranger's loyalty before trusting him with anything real, how to build a cell so that the loss of one man never meant the loss of all of them, lessons that would keep his Tokyo network alive for years longer than it had any right to survive. It was in Shanghai that he met the woman who would, indirectly, hand him the single most important recruit of his career, Agnes Smedley, an American journalist and committed radical, sympathetic to the Chinese communist cause, who moved in circles that included foreign correspondents and Asian intellectuals disillusioned with their own governments. Through Smedley, Sorge was introduced to a young Japanese newspaperman working the Shanghai bureau of the Asahi Shimbun, one of Japan's most respected dailies. His name was Hotsumi Ozaki, and he would become the second most important man in the story of Richard Sorge, and, in the end, would die alongside him. The two men talked for hours in Shanghai tea houses about Japan's future, about the war already gathering on the Chinese mainland, about a world order neither of them believed could survive much longer in its current shape. Ozaki did not need to be pressured into anything. He offered himself. 2 years in China taught Sorge his trade, how to build a network out of strangers bound only by conviction, how to run a network without ever appearing to run anything at all. When Moscow recalled him in 1932, it was not to retire him. It was to prepare him for the assignment his whole career in China had, in effect, been rehearsal for. In 1933, Richard Sorge arrived in Tokyo. And it is here that the story stops being merely about a clever spy and becomes about something rarer. A man who built, in the heart of an enemy capital, a second entirely convincing life, one so well constructed that the people closest to him would spend years defending his innocence, right up until the evidence in front of them became impossible to deny. He arrived as a journalist, and this time the cover was not a formality. It was the truth, lived in full. He wrote for the Frankfurter Zeitung, one of Germany's most respected newspapers, and stringed for others besides, filing genuinely knowledgeable, genuinely well-sourced dispatches on Japanese politics and the drift toward war in Asia. He was, by every visible measure, exactly what his byline said he was, a serious German correspondent who understood Japan better than almost anyone else filing copy back to Berlin. And because the disguise cost him nothing to maintain, because it was, in every respect but one, simply who he actually was, no one ever had reason to look behind it. The one thing he added, deliberately, was the party badge. Sorge joined the Nazi Party in Tokyo and wore that membership the way a man wears a passport, visibly, unapologetically, as proof of who he claimed to be. To the small, tight-knit German colony in Tokyo, here was a fellow National Socialist, a war veteran, a man who had bled for Germany once already and clearly loved his country. It made him, instantly, one of them, and it gave him something even more useful than trust. It gave him boredom. No one watches closely the man who already looks exactly like what he's supposed to be. And one of them meant, above all, Eugen Ott. Ott arrived in Tokyo as a German military attaché in the 1930s, rose in time to become Germany's ambassador to Japan, and became, this is the detail that made Sorge's entire operation possible, Sorge's genuine friend. They drank together. They talked long into the night about German politics, Japanese intentions, the shifting alliances of a world sliding toward war. Ott trusted Sorge's read on Japan so completely that he leaned on him to help draft the embassy's own political reports back to Berlin, which meant that Richard Sorge, a Soviet military intelligence officer, was for a period, quite literally, helping to write the German Foreign Ministry's assessment of its own allies' war plans, assessments that flowed back through the embassy in cables Sorge himself often had a hand in shaping or reading. It is difficult to imagine a more perfect seat from which to spy, not smuggling secrets out of a locked drawer, but helping to compose the very documents that carried them. There was an even sharper irony sitting at Sorge's regular dinner table. The Gestapo maintained its own liaison officer in Tokyo, a police attaché named Joseph Meisinger, a brutal veteran of the German occupation of Poland whose entire job in Japan was to watch the German colony for exactly the kind of disloyalty Sorge was built out of. Meisinger drank with him. Meisinger, by some accounts, even heard whispers over the years questioning Sorge's politics and waved them off, vouching for a fellow party man and war veteran he considered a friend. The Third Reich's own secret policeman in Tokyo spent years sitting across the table from a Soviet military intelligence officer and never once saw past the schnapps and the war stories. Away from the embassy, Sorge lived like exactly the kind of man his cover suggested. Hard-drinking, restless, magnetic, reckless with women and motorcycles in roughly equal measure. Colleagues who knew him described a man who could drink most of the German colony under the table and still turn up sharp and lucid the next morning with a finished article. He kept a Japanese mistress, a woman named Hanako Ishii, who loved him without any idea what he truly was, and who would, decades later, be the one to make sure his remains did not vanish into an unmarked grave. He also, at some point, became involved with Helma Ott, the ambassador's own wife, a fact that says everything about how completely Sorge had made himself part of that household's inner life, trusted with its most private rooms as thoroughly as he was trusted with its cables. None of it broke the friendship. If anything, the recklessness made him more convincingly human, more obviously not the kind of disciplined fanatic anyone would suspect of running a Soviet network on the side. A careful, sober, watchful man might have drawn suspicion in that jittery diplomatic colony. A charming drunk on a motorcycle drew invitations to dinner. That recklessness nearly ended everything years before the Japanese police ever touched him. In 1938, roaring home from a party on his motorcycle, drunk, Sorge crashed hard enough to fracture his jaw and several other bones, and was carried unconscious into a Tokyo hospital. For hours, doctors worked on a patient who might, under anesthesia, say almost anything in almost any language, and Richard Sorge had a decade of Soviet secrets he could not afford to talk in his sleep. He survived it, healed, and within weeks was back at embassy dinners as though nothing had happened. Another story added to the legend of the hard-living German correspondent rather than the near miss it actually was. But a network was exactly what he was running, and it reached well beyond the embassy walls, into the very cabinet of the Japanese government itself. Hotsumi Ozaki, the journalist Sorge had recruited in Shanghai, had returned to Japan and risen with quiet, genuine distinction. He worked for the research arm of the South Manchuria Railway Company, an organization that functioned as much as an intelligence and policy think tank as a railway operator, feeding Tokyo detailed analysis of events across Japan's expanding empire on the Asian mainland. More importantly, Ozaki became one of a small, informal circle of advisors who met privately with Prince Fumimaro Konoye, the Japanese Prime Minister, a group so informal it was nicknamed the Breakfast Society. Men who talked policy over morning meals with no official minutes taken and no outsider present. Ozaki did not merely have access to Japanese government thinking. He was, at moments, present in the room where that thinking was formed, and Sorge, his old friend and controller, was on the other end of every conversation Ozaki chose to share. The Breakfast Society met over rice and pickles and green tea in private rooms, never in an office, never on any government calendar, precisely so that whatever was said there would leave no paper trail for a rival faction or a foreign power to find. Konoye trusted the men at that table because they were his own chosen circle. Intellectuals and journalists he found more useful than the generals crowding his cabinet. He had no reason to imagine that one of his own trusted advisors walked out of those rooms and, within days, handed everything he had heard to a German journalist who then handed it, by radio, to Moscow. Ozaki's own motives were more complicated than simple loyalty to Moscow. He was a Japanese nationalist in his own strange way, a man who believed that a communist transformation of Asia, one that would eventually include Japan itself, offered his country a better future than the militarist path it was actually on. He was not paid, not blackmailed, not coerced. He believed the same way Sorge believed, and that belief made him patient enough to sit through years of cabinet-adjacent conversation without ever once giving himself away by word or expression. Sorge rarely took a single source at face value, even one as good as Ozaki. Where he could, he checked what came out of the Breakfast Society against what he picked up inside the German embassy. German military attachés comparing notes with their Japanese counterparts. Rumors passed at receptions. The small contradictions that separate real cabinet decisions from wishful thinking inside the foreign ministry. It was this habit of triangulation, drilled into him back in the alleys of Shanghai, that gave Moscow such confidence in what Ramsay sent. Not one man's impression of Japanese intentions, but two independent lines of access at the very top of two governments converging on the same answer. Around these two men, Sorge built out the rest of the ring. Branko Vukelic, a Yugoslav journalist writing for French publications, gave the network another set of press credentials and another plausible foreign presence in Tokyo. Yotoku Miyagi, a Japanese-born painter who had spent years in the United States before returning home, worked the harder, riskier ground, gathering details on Japanese military dispositions, the kind of granular order of battle information no cabinet advisor would casually mention over breakfast. And holding the entire apparatus together, making it more than a circle of well-informed friends, and turning it into an actual intelligence operation, was Max Clausen, a German communist and gifted radio engineer whom Moscow sent out to be Sorge's transmitter. Clausen was not a natural spy. He was, by his own later account, tired and increasingly reluctant as the years wore on, a man who had grown a genuine fondness for the ordinary business life he built as cover. He ran a small trading company in Tokyo that turned an honest profit, and there were periods when he let radio schedules slip simply because the paperwork of his cover business had eaten his week. But when he sat down to transmit, he was meticulous. He built and rebuilt radio sets by hand, disguised the antennae, moved the equipment between safe houses, and sat for hours tapping out coded traffic to a Soviet receiving station across the water in Vladivostok, in a country where the state's own laws made unlicensed radio transmission itself a capital offense, and where the secret police maintained an entire apparatus for hunting exactly this kind of signal. To understand what that meant, you have to understand what Tokyo actually was in these years for a man like Clausen. Japan in the 1930s and into the war was a police state layered over a police state. The peace preservation law had already criminalized dangerous thoughts for over a decade, and a dedicated agency, the Toko, the Special Higher Police, existed for the sole purpose of hunting down communists, foreign agents, and anyone suspected of harboring either. Behind the Toko stood the military's own police arm, the Kempeitai, with its own network of informants reaching into every neighborhood and workplace. Radio direction-finding vans could triangulate an illegal transmitter to within a few city blocks if it stayed on the air too long. Clausen learned to keep his sessions short, to move constantly, to bury the set and dig it up again, to live with the certainty that a single mistimed transmission could end everything in an afternoon. More than once, a direction-finding van worked its way close enough that Clausen simply went dark mid-transmission and did not come back on the air for days, letting Moscow wait rather than risk the signal. Every message that reached Vladivostok was a message sent under the specific daily threat of a knock on the door that would not be followed by an explanation. His wife, Anna, whom he had met and married back in Shanghai, was not a passive bystander to any of it. She helped with couriering and coding, a second set of steady hands in a household that could not afford a single nervous one, and it was a marriage built, like so many in this story, on a shared secret neither of them could ever mention outside their own four walls. It was this apparatus, Sorge's access at the top, Ozaki's whispers from inside the cabinet, Miyagi's ground-level military detail, Clausen's radio threading it all back to Moscow, that would, within a few short years, hand the Soviet Union two of the most consequential warnings any spy network delivered in the entire Second World War. The first, Stalin would ignore. The second would help save his capital. By the spring of 1941, Sorge's position inside the German embassy had made him privy to something Berlin was trying very hard to keep hidden even from its own ally. Adolf Hitler was preparing to invade the Soviet Union, an ally with whom Germany had signed a very public, very deliberate, non-aggression pact less than 2 years earlier. Through Ott's confidences, through the drift of cable traffic and gossip among German officers passing through Tokyo, Sorge began piecing together the shape of what would become Operation Barbarossa, the scale of it, the direction of it, and eventually, the timing of it. In May of 1941, he transmitted a warning that German forces were massing for an attack, with troop numbers running into the hundreds of divisions along the Soviet frontier. Weeks later, he refined it further, warning that the invasion was coming in the final days of June. He was right, almost to the day. German forces crossed the Soviet border on the 22nd of June, 1941. There was a bitter irony sitting underneath all of it. Germany and Japan had signed the Anti-Comintern Pact back in 1936, an alliance built explicitly around opposing world communism, later joined by fascist Italy into a full three-power axis. The two governments most publicly committed to destroying the Soviet system on Earth were, in Tokyo, sharing a city with a Soviet military intelligence officer who had turned their own alliance's diplomatic traffic into his primary source of intelligence. And Stalin did not listen. He had been fed a flood of warnings that spring from British intelligence, from his own border patrols, from multiple agents across Europe, and he had waved almost all of them away, convinced that Hitler would not open a second front while Britain remained unconquered, and suspicious that the warnings themselves were a British provocation designed to drag him into war early. There was a deeper reason, too. Stalin's own purges of the 1930s had gutted the ranks of Soviet military intelligence, executing or imprisoning officer after officer on suspicion of disloyalty. And the men who survived learned that delivering unwelcome news to the Kremlin could be its own kind of death sentence. A climate like that does not reward honest warnings. It rewards silence or flattery, and Sorge's report went into that same pile of ignored intelligence. Popular retellings claim Stalin scrawled a dismissive note calling Sorge a source who ran factories and brothels in Tokyo and could not be trusted. A colorful line whose exact wording historians still argue over, but whose substance is not in dispute. Moscow discounted its best-placed spy in Asia at the exact moment his information was most literally, catastrophically correct. Within days, Soviet cities were burning, entire army groups were being encircled, and the war Stalin had gambled would not come was already tearing through his western frontier. You would think a man ignored so completely, so disastrously, might have been finished as a trusted source. He was not. Because 4 months later, Richard Sorge was about to hand Moscow a second warning, and this time, whether from necessity, from corroboration, or simply because there was no other information to act on, the Kremlin would listen. By September of 1941, the war Stalin had refused to believe was coming had become the worst crisis of his life. German Army Group Center was driving on Moscow with a speed that stunned even its own commanders. Whole Soviet armies had been encircled and destroyed in the opening weeks. By autumn, the Wehrmacht stood within striking distance of the capital itself, close enough that the government began preparing to evacuate east. And hanging over every decision the Soviet High Command made was the same paralyzing question it had lived with for a decade. If we strip the Far East of troops to save Moscow, will Japan strike our undefended back? It was not an idle fear. Japan and the Soviet Union had fought a real bloody border war only 2 years earlier at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, Japanese and Soviet forces clashing along the Mongolian frontier in a conflict that ended in a decisive Soviet victory under a young general named Georgy Zhukov, but one that left both sides with fresh memories of just how quickly the border could ignite again. Thousands of men had died on both sides in that undeclared war, and the lesson Tokyo took from its defeat there was not one that made a second round against the Red Army look appealing. There were factions inside the Japanese military, the so-called Strike North faction, who had wanted exactly that, a coordinated assault on Siberia timed to Hitler's invasion, catching the Soviet Union in the two-front war it had always dreaded most. This was the question Ozaki, sitting inside the Konoye government's inner circle, was uniquely positioned to answer. Through the late summer and into the autumn of 1941, the Japanese cabinet and its imperial conferences were wrestling with exactly this choice: North against the Soviets, or South against the American, British, and Dutch colonial holdings that controlled the oil and rubber Japan's war machine desperately needed. Ozaki heard the argument from the inside, the Strike South faction gathering strength, the calculation that America's oil embargo made the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia the more urgent target, that Siberia in winter offered nothing but frozen ground and a costly war against an enemy that had already beaten them once. He passed what he heard to Sorge. Sorge passed it, through Clausen's radio set, to Moscow. The message that mattered most arrived in the early autumn. Japan had made its decision. The strike would go south against the Western powers, not north against the Soviet Union. The northern frontier for the foreseeable future was safe. It is worth sitting with what that sentence actually did. Somewhere close to 1 million Soviet soldiers, aircraft, and tanks had been held in the Far East for years, frozen in place by a fear that had just, in a single radio transmission, been lifted. Through the autumn, Siberian divisions, fresh, cold-weather trained, entirely untouched by the catastrophic battles of the summer, began in training west along the Trans-Siberian Railway, a journey of thousands of miles, arriving in the nick of time to be thrown into the desperate defense and then the counteroffensive that, in December 1941, drove the German army back from the outskirts of Moscow for the first time since the invasion began. Historians continue to debate precisely how much weight Sorge's specific warning carried against everything else Soviet intelligence was independently gathering that autumn. Stalin had other sources, other signals, and had likely begun the transfers before Sorge's message even arrived. But no serious account disputes that the warning existed, that it was accurate, and that it told Moscow, at the worst hour of the war, that its back was clear. Richard Sorge had just delivered, from inside the enemy's own embassy, one of the most consequential pieces of intelligence of the entire Second World War. He would be under arrest within days. The chain that unraveled the Sorge ring did not begin with him at all. It began, as these things so often do, somewhere small and unconnected, with the arrest of a minor Japanese communist activist under interrogation by the Toko, the special higher police, whose sweeping surveillance of leftist networks across Japan had never fully stopped even as war consumed the government's attention. Under questioning, threads led to other threads, names to other names, the way a single loose stitch can be pulled until an entire garment comes apart. By early October 1941, those threads had reached Yotoku Miyagi, the painter who had spent years quietly gathering military detail for Sorge's network. He was arrested, and in the agony of Japanese police interrogation, brutal by design, the Toko's methods were not gentle with suspected traitors. The thread kept unraveling. Miyagi, cornered and understanding exactly what his arrest would mean for the friends he had spent a decade protecting, tried to throw himself from a window during questioning rather than talk. He survived the fall, badly injured, and under continued interrogation the thread kept unraveling anyway. It reached Hotsumi Ozaki within days. And on the 18th of October, 1941, barely more than 2 weeks after his ring's warning about Japan's southern strategy had gone out over Clausen's radio, it reached Richard Sorge himself. He was arrested at his home. The police came for him in daylight, without theater. There was no need for it. A man who believed himself untouchable does not run. He is said to have remained composed even as they searched the house, the same unhurried self-possession that had carried him through 8 years of embassy dinners, now carrying him through the first hour of his own ending. Ambassador Eugen Ott, when he learned that his friend, his trusted German confidant, the man who had helped him draft cables to Berlin, was being held as a Soviet spy, simply could not believe it. He would go on protesting Sorge's innocence to the German Foreign Ministry for some time afterward, a measure of exactly how complete the cover had been. It had not just fooled the Japanese authorities who eventually caught him. It had fooled, to the very end, the man who had trusted him most. Josef Meisinger, the Gestapo's own man in Tokyo, the one whose entire job had been to sniff out disloyalty in the German colony, the one who had shared Sorge's table and vouched for him for years, was left to explain to Berlin how a Soviet officer had sat beside him at dinner for the better part of a decade while he watched for spies and somehow never once looked in the right direction. What followed was not a quick execution and not a quiet exchange. It was years. Sorge was interrogated at length, and eventually he did something almost no captured intelligence officer of his caliber does. He talked. Not everything, and not immediately, but over time he gave a substantial, detailed account of his network's operations, apparently calculating, wrongly, as it turned out, that the Soviet Union would move to protect or exchange so valuable an asset, and that a full account might buy him leverage or time. Left largely alone with paper in his cell in the years that followed, Sorge wrote out an extensive account of his own career in intelligence work, a document that would later become one of the most detailed confessions any Soviet agent of his generation ever produced. Thorough, almost scholarly, the record of a man who seemed determined that if his life's work was going to end in a Japanese cell, at least an accurate account of it would survive him. The trial itself, held in closed session, moved slowly through a war that Japan was visibly losing by the month. American bombers were already reaching the home islands by the time judgment came down. Prosecutors built their case around the sheer scale of what the ring had passed to Moscow. Years of political and military intelligence, including the two warnings that mattered most, the invasion of the Soviet Union and the direction of Japan's own war. Sorge's defense rested on very little because there was very little to dispute. What he offered instead, in his long written statements, was less a denial than an explanation, an unrepentant account of a man who said he had simply never stopped believing in the cause he had chosen as a wounded 19-year-old in a German field hospital, and who was not going to start pretending otherwise now in a Tokyo courtroom, with the rope already visible at the end of it. Moscow, meanwhile, did nothing of the kind in return. The Soviet government never publicly acknowledged that Richard Sorge was one of its agents. There was no diplomatic pressure, no offer of exchange, no acknowledgement at all, only official silence, as though the man who had helped save Moscow had never existed. He and Ozaki were tried in Japanese courts, the proceedings dragging on for years against the backdrop of a war that was, by 1944, going catastrophically for Japan itself. Both men were convicted of espionage and sentenced to death. And on the morning of the 7th of November 1944, chosen, by grim historical coincidence, as the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution the two men had served, Hotsumi Ozaki was hanged first in Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. Richard Sorge was executed the same day in the same prison. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in a Tokyo cemetery for foreign criminals, one more nameless plot among the dead of a losing war, and for years afterward no government on earth stepped forward to claim him. It was Hanako Ishii, the mistress who had loved him without ever knowing what he truly was, who years later located his remains and had them properly reburied, and who spent decades keeping his memory alive in Japan, almost alone. The Soviet Union itself said nothing for 2 full decades. Only in 1964, in the different political climate of the Khrushchev era, did Moscow finally formally acknowledge Richard Sorge as one of its own, naming him a hero of the Soviet Union and unveiling his story to a public that had never been told it. By then, the man Hitler's own ambassador had called a friend, the man who had helped save Stalin's capital from inside the swastika-marked walls of the German embassy, had been dead for 20 years, hanged in a Tokyo prison yard, and for most of that time, officially, forgotten by the very country he had died serving.